Maybe that's why trees scare me. It's like they have hidden powers.
So what you just witnessed there are the two very different ends of the Australian New Wave spectrum. And what this shows is the two extremely different and wild ends of this film movement, as there's two completely different influences of the film movement as it goes along. The beginning of it is a more exploitation style of the genre, and it more so focuses on stuff like the American exploitation movement. While the second half of the genre is more so focused on things like the French New Wave, and its much more non-linear approaches to the storytelling. On one end of the spectrum you have films like Sweetie, which generally speaking throughout its runtime is much more influenced by the new wave of the 1960s and more so than any other of the film periods of the time. It has a less cohesive feel, more closely resembling something like Persona, as well as Cleo 5 to 7 more so than any of the other film periods at the time. The film Sweetie has a much less cohesive narrative as a whole, as it sort of has a non-linear structure to it that makes it so it's somewhat disorienting and confusing as you watch and it goes along. Sweetie also has the very French New Wave feel to it, as even though it's a comedy, it still has a level of grit to it, and it's a lot more dirty and grimy than most people think of comedies as a whole, and it makes it have the more commonly perceived go along with the French New Wave, because almost every film in the French New Wave had that more gritty and disorienting look to it. Now, in a much earlier example of the Australian New Wave is the film Mad Max, which is a much more strong influence from the exploitation genre of the early 70s. Unlike Sweetie, Mad Max has a much more cohesive narrative and has the same level of grit as many other exploitation films of the time, fitting more so under the lines of like a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre more so than a film like Sweetie. Now, what influenced these two movements were two completely different societal expectations at the time, as both were periods of extreme unrest within Australia at the time. For example, George Miller, the director of the two Mad Max films, has always considered himself more of a political activist and was raised by two immigrant parents, leading to his films having a more aggressive tone towards the Australian government. On the other hand, Jane Champagne was raised in New Zealand and went around Europe for most of her life, so she was able to see the other societal problems that they had in comparison to other countries. And within all the societal unrest of the film industry of the 70s and 80s and 90s, this all came to a head in the New Wave movements, especially with the ones in Australia. And in conclusion, both of these films show the influences of the Australian New Wave movement. And both films show that Australian New Wave was heavily influenced by exploitation films and French New Wave.